Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. March 18th, 3/18, is Trisomy-18 Awareness Day, 3/18. It's also called Edwards syndrome. It involves an extra copy of chromosome 18. And March 18 was chosen precisely because of that genetic pattern. The deeper issue I want to highlight about today, though, is that children with trisomy 18, Down syndrome, and other chromosomal variants have too often been discussed in public life, public policies, and frankly, global conversation, through the language of things like burden and cost and strain and inconvenience. I'd like to juxtapose this event, then, with the fact that Paul Ehrlich, the infamous author of The Population Bomb, he died on March the 13th. He was 93 years old. His ideas helped furnish the moral grammar for that entire way of thinking. The Christian and natural law vision teaches that man is created in the image of God. The Catechism teaches that human dignity is rooted in the divine image. Scripture calls children a heritage from the Lord, the fruit of the womb a reward. The worth of a child doesn't rise and fall with lifespan or ability or even social convenience. A child with an extra chromosome has the exact same ontological dignity as the valedictorian, the Olympic athlete, the Nobel laureate, the finance executive who imagines himself indispensable. Well, that child may actually carry greater moral significance for our society because he exposes to us whether our society still recognizes human dignity as intrinsic. Modern prenatal culture, unfortunately, has been moving steadily in the opposite direction. This is the global culture. Iceland cited an above 85% screening and close to terminating 100% of pregnancies of Down syndrome and other genetic issues discovered in the womb. Denmark, they report termination rates at about 98% after prenatal diagnosis. Earlier reporting on Danish screening actually shows a dramatic fall in births of children with Down syndrome and things like trisomy 18 after national screening protocols were greatly expanded. In other words, in global medical language right now, some children are basically being told they are unwelcome long before they can draw their first breath. This is eugenics. There's no way around it. This is eugenics. China, I just got back from Taiwan, and Chinese culture and philosophical thinking permeates the Taiwanese culture to a large degree. And China's even harsher as a case study because demographic engineering there has been tied to things like state priorities. There's a culture of son preference and birth quality concerns. Recent research on China's birth defect prevention regime shows that they had a strategy, carrier screening, prenatal screening, intervention, and there were real ethical concerns around their policy environment. But simply put, China to this day wrestles with a distorted sex ratio at birth. The son preference still endures, so much so that you've got too many men and too few women who are of marriage age. And so China is going to greatly suffer a population crisis in the next 1.5 generations. Scholarly work on their two-child transition found that the older 1.5-child regime intensified that imbalance. In all those atmospheres, a child with a disability like trisomy 18 or Down syndrome had very little cultural leverage. They were frankly murdered after birth because the combined pressures of things like state planning, family expectations, social stigma meant that they couldn't risk it. If you only have the quote-unquote right to have 1 or 2 children, you want every one of them to be as productive as possible. In steps one of the fathers of this paradigm. He was his work was awful. His name is Paul Ehrlich. In The Population Bomb, Ehrlich opened with a sentence: "The battle to feed all of humanity is over." He warned us that in the 1970s and 80s, hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death. And then he argued that society must have population control at home, hopefully through changes in our value system, and by that he meant stop valuing the family. And then he says, but by compulsion, if voluntary methods fail, which means stop valuing marriage and the family, and if the families don't listen, governments force them to stop having children. And In fact, one paperback slogan of his book summarizes his entire creed in 6 words: population control or the race to oblivion. As if kill your children or the human race will cease to exist. That's exactly what he was saying. Ehrlich's intellectual lineage runs through, you've got people like Thomas Malthus, and you've got these neo-Malthusian writers, Fairfield Osborne, William Vogt. Their books in 1948 ignited this mid-century panic about population and limited resources. The central error in that tradition is that it rejects the Judeo-Christian conviction that man bears the image of God. It rejects the natural law insight that the human person is an end in himself. Once you surrender that premise, every ugly policy begins to look reasonable. And so forced sterilization, abortion, disability, all of these things just become tandem to the conversation of the human person. Children are described as emission producers. I remember living in California, and one of my colleagues was inviting his 6th child into the world, and we were all rejoicing for him. And another colleague, completely avowed progressivist in mentality, said, "Wow, you really don't care about the environment having so many children." That's an Ehrlichian way of thinking. Because Ehrlich, for all of his predictions, he actually proved spectacularly wrong on the empirical side. And I mean spectacularly. The Green Revolution sharply increased agricultural output. Global food productions rose dramatically. Commodity prices Paul Ehrlich had a wager with Julian Simon. And so they made a wager. Ehrlich predicted that because of the limitation of resources would rise to alarming rates. In fact, the prices of resources fell: chromium, copper, nickel, tin, and tungsten. So much so that newer work on superabundance argues that over long stretches, growing populations can coincide with greater resource accessibility because human creativity changes the economic picture. In other words, yes, people are consumers, but they're also producers, they're inventors, they're builders, they're laborers, they're discoverers, they're problem solvers. They're policy makers. A baby grows up to become a scientist, an engineer, a laborer, a nurse, entrepreneur, farmer, teacher, mother, priest, craftsman, what have you. And that's why Paul Ehrlich simply didn't fathom the value of the human person that was so necessary in this conversation. Now, there were other thinkers that exposed him. Julian Simon was one of them. You also had, I'm going to mention some of these names, Esther Bozarab, Amartya Sen. But the point I want to stress is that Paul Ehrlich was so popular that in my empirical science education, his worldview was what we were taught, that population control was the way to go. And so you've got a development of what we call sentimental environmentalism. My friend Wes Smith of the Discovery Institute talks with me on my program about that topic constantly. The emotional script is familiar. If human beings are the problem, stop reproducing, stop having human children, save the planet, save the forest, save the river, save the human species. Now, sure, you can have a legitimate moral concern there. We need to steward our resources well. But now the push is neo-paganism, that nature has more rights than man. Man is the problem. The way forward is refreshingly plain. Societies need more children. We simply cannot survive. We become the authors of our own economic demise and social and cultural and political demise as well. Societies need more children. We need stronger marriages, stable homes, affordable housing, sane taxation, family wages, maternal and paternal support, and a public ethic that welcomes every life in the womb rather than screening it away. Scripture calls children a gift. Natural law confirms a civilization renews itself through families. So yes, that child in the womb could well become the arbiter and the designer of the innovation that transforms the trajectory of human history. So no, Paul Ehrlich was wrong. The child in the womb, or the child with the extra chromosome, is never the crisis. The real crisis lives in the society that has forgotten how invaluable a child really is. Stay tuned, I'm Marcus Peter.